But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the deadly feud between Caracalla and Geta, the Roman brothers whose rivalry shattered an empire. Born to rule together, jealousy turned them into bitter enemies. After their father's death, whispers of betrayal filled the imperial court, culminating in Caracalla's shocking murder of Geta in their mother's chambers, a brutal act that sent Rome into chaos. Discover the psychological depths of their conflict, the devastation felt by their mother, and the instability that followed. Join us for a story of ambition, betrayal, and the dark side of power in ancient Rome.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we take it back once again to ancient Rome, to two people who I think are a little bit unheard of to people who are kind of casual fans of Roman history, and that's Caracalla and his brother Geta, which are commonly known as the Roman Cain and Abel. So for those of you who know the history or the story from the Bible, that's going to tell you exactly where this story is leading to. And they're also featured in the new Gladiator movie coming out later this year. So we thought it would be a good time to see a little bit of the history on them, because their story is again, it's the Cain and Abel story, two brothers growing up in Imperial Rome with a lot of change happening, and they don't really get along very well. And it's really difficult for, the loved ones involved in the two boys. And we start to see that the Roman emperor and the Roman imperial office has really changed a lot, and it's going to go down a really dark path, as they don't call it the crisis of the 3rd century for nothing. And really, when Caracalla and Geta come onto the scene, it's really starting to be that 3rd century. So, I think when we look back on Roman history, they definitely have a part to play in that crisis and kind of I wouldn't say downfall, but the decline of the Roman Empire for almost a century.
Yeah, I think these episodes are so interesting. I think out of the two of us, I would probably dub you the Roman history expert. So I always find that I'm trying to learn as much as I can within the scope of an episode, which is very, very difficult, because Roman history is not something very easy to pin down, to say the least. But I think for this particular story with Caracalla and Geta, at least like a high level takeaway from me, this is a pretty profound tragedy of sibling rivalry. You have elements of like political ambition. You start talking about the themes of what does it actually mean to have absolute power and kind of this perilous nature of that. And you see a life that we'll get into that's kind of marked by both this ideal of grandeur in many ways, but also this silver lining of like instability throughout the entirety of their lifetimes.
It's interesting, too, how this kind of paints a picture on the transfer of power when you have multiple sons. Up to this point in Rome, it kind of worked out because there was typically one older brother or one person who was very clearly going to take over, or it got to the point where the emperor had no sons at all and had to adopt and find someone really good. It's very rare that we get multiple sons who are alive to the age where they can both be reigned as co-emperors with their father. And we see this within Rome after this point. The empire is getting so big and so complex, and the Emperor Diocletian is going to come onto the scene in about 60 to 70 years, and he's going to actually split the empire up and try to have like this co-ruler, kind of almost like a council that kind of runs everything. And it works, and then it blows up because one person has more power, one person wants ultimate power. And it's kind of the start of this experiment that we see emperors do, is trying to share power, trying to understand that one person can't control this vast, diverse, multi-ethnic, just massive empire. But it really just leads to a lot of issues and a lot of conflict. And I think this is the first time we really see that attempt at power sharing really fail, because in the past, there really hasn't been too much of that. And if it did happen, it was, you'd almost have like a 1A and a 1B, where the second person knew kind of where they were in that power ranking, wouldn't really have those ambitions, or they were already really close with the person that they were in power with. And a lot of times they were just friends. This wasn't a blood relationship where they were kind of forced to work together. These were two people that have trusted each other for a long time. And we look at Augustus, and he had Marcus Agrippa, who was his right-hand man, who was definitely not at a co-emperor level, but had so much influence, but never got to the point where he kind of thought, hey, I can do a little bit of a better job. You know, him and Augustus were such good friends that it was not even, you know, it was an unthinkable thing. Think about anybody else other than Augustus running. So we see little bits of it, but this is, I think, the first time we really see like two family members trying to run an empire together and with their father at the same time. And it's just tricky because egos, political rivalries, and just, you know, families fight all the time. And when you put them in power of the most powerful empire in the world, you know, it's a tricky ending for a lot of people involved.
Yeah, I think sharing power in and of itself is not an easy feat. Or I think you brought us some interesting points. Like when we talk about in the modern context, at least there is like a clear delineation of who's in charge of what and discrete accountabilities for, you know, that whatever power structure we're looking at. And there's different tiers and levels of how that structure kind of happens. But to co-share absolute power is kind of an oxymoron in many ways, right? How can you have absolute power if you are co-sharing it or co-ruling with someone else? And in this circumstance, it's going to be someone that you don't necessarily see eye to eye with or have kind of like strategic alignment on how to actually govern properly. And what you end up with, as we'll see, is a very fractious relationship that, you know, devolves pretty rapidly. But I don't think there was ever, you know, we'll get into it, a little foreshadowing here, but there was never really that kind of cohesive family unit element. At least that's what I kind of gleaned from my research.
Yeah, it's tricky to even tell. And you mentioned too about how, you know, we go back and try to read Roman history from certain perspectives, and it's tough to know necessarily what's going on within the family circles because we don't have great sources of, you know, what's going on behind closed doors. A lot of the time it's a lot of stuff written after the fact, and there's people writing at the time talking about what they're seeing from the outside. But you're right, it definitely doesn't seem like everyone was sitting down at the dinner table every night and having a nice family meal and sharing stories and those sort of things. It definitely seemed like there was an edge to kind of everything. But, you know, when we kind of talk about families in the Roman Empire and, you know, emperors and their sons and how influential that can be, we have to start by talking about Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus. So this whole story really starts with the 5 good emperors and Marcus Aurelius being the last one. So when we talked about Marcus Aurelius, we said he's this great emperor, great Stoic philosopher, spent so much of his life campaigning in the north to really seal Rome's northern border and bring some stability to that region, which he's able to do. But at the same time, a massive plague hits basically the entire known world around the Mediterranean. And a lot of people die and things kind of settle down a little bit. So when Marcus Aurelius dies, he puts his son Commodus in charge. And we all know how Commodus was a complete disaster, considered maybe the worst Roman emperor of all time, had no interest in governing, just wanted to fight as a gladiator and spend money like it was going out of style. But he lived in a world that was relatively stable. Like I said, this plague wiped out a lot of people, not just on the Roman side, but on the Germanic side and all of these other tribes that have been giving the Romans a little bit of headaches on the northern border. So they're pretty weak themselves. So despite Commodus's poor governing, the empire's not really in a crisis. So Commodus is able to hang around a little bit longer than he probably would have otherwise if there was some crisis that needed attending to. But the most important thing about Commodus was he took the institutions that had been the key part of Roman life for a long time. So we had something called the cursus honorum, where you would start your life out holding public office. And then if you did that for so many years, you could move up, and then eventually become a consul for the year. That was kind of the more republican system, but that hung around a lot in the Imperial Rome. And we still had the emperor at the top, but this was still a very honorable way to move up. It kept that stability. You had senators who had so much power within the empire and kept the emperor in check a little bit. The emperor definitely had to keep the Senate on their side. They had to keep the army on their side, and they had to keep the people on their side. Commodus destroys so much of that because he comes in and he starts putting his friends in charge. He sells offices to the highest bidder because he just needs more money to fund his games and all the things that he's trying to do. And this really, not only does it destroy these institutions, if you're looking at this from the outside and going, what a disaster Rome is becoming, this whole system has failed. There's nothing that can be recovered from this. The Senate is a disaster. It's all paid off. You know, governors are being paid off. There's even stories where governors would get to their post before they even arrived. Commodus would have sold the position to somebody else. So they would arrive and about a week later, somebody else shows up and goes, oh, actually, I'm in charge now because I just paid Commodus a little bit more money. And so this whole institution, this whole system just looks very broken from the outside. And that's the world that Commodus is kind of set up for whatever is going to come next. And we'll get into, who those people are as they come onto the scene. But Commodus has really torn apart a lot of these institutions. And one thing we know about these institutions, it took Rome a long time to really build them up and build those traditions, but he ripped them apart really, really quickly. And so there's now two angles that can go. You can either go down the system is broken and don't trust the system, or you can say, hey, the system's actually good. This guy was just a little nuts. Let's try to bring things back together, and we'll see where it goes. But Rome has changed fundamentally forever at this point.
I think that's such a great way to categorize, or at least contextualize, the backdrop of this episode, right? So many themes kind of come out in your analysis. I know you covered a lot there. The thing that really stands out to me is, in many cases, we'd look at individuals, but this is very much like a case study in effective or, depending on the character, ineffective leadership. What could take, hundreds of years, centuries to build can be undone in one lifetime by the wrong person.
Yeah, it's a kind of a sad and almost terrifying way to think about it, right? Because you get someone in with absolute power. And I think, part of the world we live in, why we have democracy and so many of the checks and balances in place, is to stop things like this from happening. But at the same time, who knows, right? Some of these things can get torn down so quickly. And people point to, when did Rome's decline really begin? And it starts with this. It starts with tearing down of these institutions and more power going into one person's hand, and not having those checks and balances, not having a Senate that really has any sort of power, and not having a way for ambitious men to rise up the political ranks outside of being a great military commander. So if military is the only way you're ever going to gain any power, civil wars are going to start just as quickly as they stop. And that's why there's this crisis of the 3rd century. This stability is a thing of the past now for the Roman people. But with that being said, Commodus is assassinated after people were kind of sick of him for a long time. And guess what? Civil war breaks out. There's no clear succession line. Lots of people vying for the throne. You have situations where Praetorian Guard actually sells the office to the highest bidder at one point, but then people assassinate that guy because they're like, how dare you buy the position? And it's just a mess of different people coming in. But somebody does step up and bring stability to Rome for about a decade and a half, which is, is for, again, the 3rd century is quite significant. So this is where Septimius Severus comes into play. And he's the father of Caracalla and Geta. And so he seizes power in 193 after this brutal civil war. So he was born in a city called Leptis Magna, which is an African city in modern day Libya, which is really far from the traditional Roman power centers. And it's really interesting because over these years, we've started to see the Roman emperor come from different places. It used to be purely, you have to be Italian, and not just Italy as we think today, like the province of Italia, which is like around Rome. You're not from the north. You're definitely not from Sicily. You're from Italy. And now that's started to change. You have emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, whose families are Spanish. And then you have, again, someone coming from Africa, not only from Africa, but from a city that's got some level of influence, but not the influence of, maybe what we see in the East or we see in other parts of Greece or any areas like that, even Egypt for that fact. This is someone who's close to Rome, has a Roman history, Roman family, but ultimately isn't someone you would think is going to really shape the empire in any way. But he manages to do that because he's a brilliant military leader. He's got a lot of experience in war, and he's very ruthless. He's very tactically strong, and he does get a little bit of luck, as anybody does. Things do go his way. But ultimately, the empire is just in such a mess. And he comes in, strong military presence, really locks everything down, stabilizes the empire. Everyone goes, great. This Severus guy, he's going to set things right. We're going to be on the right track. Because after years of Commodus, all people can think about is chaos and plague, and just, this is really terrible. So Severus is in power, but he makes some reforms that go a little bit differently than maybe some people would have wanted. He strengthens the army. So he starts doing something where he's paying the army a lot of money. And so this starts to be the thing where every time a new emperor comes in or a current emperor's in, the army's sitting there going, where's my raise? Where's my bonus? When they don't get it, there's somebody else who's like, hey, if you put me in power, I'm going to give you a little bit of extra money. And they go, great, we're going to fight for you now. And essentially the Roman army slightly starts to turn into a mercenary force, not in the traditional sense, but a little bit more where they're sitting there expecting that payment that's coming out. And Severus uses that to his advantage. He keeps giving the army money and they keep supporting him. And so he makes these reforms around the army and around himself. So he centralizes control around one person and his office. And so with Severus, he doesn't make any attempts to restore any of the old ways. He just says, the army's the most important, I'm the most important, and ultimately turns Rome into this series of autocratic military dictators for a long time. And that's the world that Caracalla and Geta are born into. They've seen their father come in and stamp out all of this civil war and all this instability with a hard iron fist, strong military presence, just rule around one single person. So as we foreshadowed, power sharing doesn't seem like something that Septimius Severus has any interest in doing. He eventually does get there, but it ultimately comes down to, I'm in charge. The army backs me. What else do I need?
I think it's interesting. While I was doing some research on his bio, and I think you did a great job talking about his kind of, working his way through the ranks. He is obviously this great military leader who definitely emphasizes, the importance of a strong military and militarized government almost. But I read this little factoid that I'll share that he actually allowed soldiers to marry. So it seems like it was a departure from like more traditional norms, integrating military and civilian life. And it's interesting. It almost seems like it's almost a way to kind of integrate these two to make it more commonplace to, amongst the rest of the population to normalize how militaristic that this regime is going to be versus ones that have come before him.
That's a really interesting point, because you're right. Like, if his whole thing is military, I need the military on my side. Sure, money helps, but eventually money's going to run out, right? And little other reforms like that definitely probably went a long way. And you're right, it just goes to show he's doubling down on making the military as strong and as loyal, not to the state, but to him. And that's going to be his kind of key thing going forward. And I think that's a great point on some of the other things that he was looking at doing.
I think on that front too, when I was doing this research, I probably donned too much of the hat of a family psychologist. I couldn't help myself because the family dynamics in this episode are absolutely fascinating. I know we've talked about Septimius quite a bit, but he does have, I don't want to call her better half, but I'll leave that up to the audience to decide. But his wife and, the mother of Caracalla and Geta, Julia Domna. So she was born in modern day Syria into a family of, considerable prestige as well. Her father, I believe, was the high priest of the sun god, so a very, high-ranking official in that particular culture. Her lineage was noble, and her upbringing was pretty privileged. She was immersed in a very rich intellectual, tradition of the Hellenistic East. So she was very educated. She was by no means, at least from my understanding, like a traditional woman at this point. For most historians, she was fluent in Greek and Latin, well-versed in philosophy, literature, and the arts. She was known for her beauty. I'll take that with a grain of salt. Really just depends on who's capturing those details. But it was her intellect that set her apart. Interestingly enough, so a prophecy had actually foretold that she would marry a king. And this, coupled with very good political strategy, attracted Septimius Severus to her. And they actually ended up getting married in 187 AD, a union that would kind of blend Roman, Punic, and Syrian cultures together. And I think for me, as someone who's not super familiar with Roman history, it's so interesting to see this kind of amalgamation of cultures that even for someone who loves history would never have really thought about prior to getting, deep into the weeds as I did for this particular episode.
It's so fascinating how quickly things change too, right? Like hearing, we've talked, every time we've talked about Rome, we always talk about fighting the Persians and the Parthian Empire and all these Eastern threats to them and being the big rivals, right? People make their careers off campaigning in the East, but to hear kind of that Eastern influence is coming into the imperial family, that's a big change. Like we said before, not only is it, the emperor's not from Italy and they're coming from Spain, or maybe they're coming from Illyria or somewhere in the Balkans. Like, oh boy, that's a big change. Now you got someone from North Africa, and he's marrying someone who's got a lot more of an Eastern presence to her and Eastern upbringing. That's a complete change to what we're seeing with this empire. And it is a very multi-ethnic empire, and it always has been and always will be. But there was always this little bit of Italians were kind of the greatest. And, that's why Rome is so successful. And you can start to see as things change, things open up a little bit and people are a little bit more I think part of it too is when you have someone like Hadrian and Trajan who come in who aren't Italian or aren't born in Italy, I should say, and they are so successful. You start to see, a little bit of that change. But at the end of the day, military force wins out, and that's why Severus is in charge. But you think he'd potentially want to do something to legitimatize himself more on the, okay, yeah, I'm not from Italy, but maybe I'll marry an Italian woman. But no, he's just going for the religious element with the Romans is prophecy, religion. Mm-hmm. They go a long way. And I think that's the route he seems to go with here, which I think is a little interesting because it is a big change. But at the end of the day, it's still grounded in things Romans love. We have the religious elements, and then we also have the military strength. And you got those two. The Romans can maybe look past a little bit of, hey, this person's not necessarily from our neck of the woods, but still Roman, still part of our culture. And, we'll see how it goes.
No, I think it's such an interesting point, right? I think for most people who, are casual fans of history, this is one of those little facts that would really kind of blow your mind in many ways, right? Because I think a lot of people would default to that whole narrative of, Italy, Rome, and, kind of seeing both of them as like this one-to-one parity. But the massiveness of this empire and, how inclusive it is of other ethnicities really does kind of flip the script in many ways on what I think most people would think about if they aren't very familiar with this period of time. And I think this particular story is as interesting because it parallels some of those themes. So was Julia. She's breaking some very traditional boundaries here. She wasn't content staying in the background. She's an active participant in governance. She accompanied Severus on his military campaigns. She managed a lot of his correspondence, engaged with philosophers and scholars. She kind of formed this very renowned intellectual circle that she, was kind of the linchpin for. And her patronage extended to figures like Galen, the physician that has been studied, or, other philosophers. And you can see her influence in the imperial court as very, very significant. She earned the title Mater Castrorum, which is the mother of camps, reflecting, kind of this role of her being on the battlefield, but still having this duality of being, a central figure in Roman politics. So her presence in many ways is a very stabilizing force. And I assume, there's a lot of inference, but based on some of like the historical data that was captured, her counsel was very valued by Severus. So you kind of see this, I'll call it a partnership of power in many ways. I'm sure there was personal elements for it, of course, but in many ways, I kind of walked away thinking that this is a partnership that tried to strengthen the empire. They had contrasting but complementary strengths that created a very formidable duo with his military acumen, her intellectual prowess, when, coming together could address some of the complexities of ruling over a very vast and diverse empire.
It's such a good point because you're right. I like the duality of kind of approaching things differently. And everyone who talks about it, and all the historical sources when they talk about her, it's always, very brilliant, very, very well spoken, great politically in the sense that, she can have a conversation with anybody. And I think that's important not so much important, but I think it goes to show why somebody like Severus was able to maintain his rule for so long. I think part of it is, definitely the military element of, if no one's going to fight you, you don't have much to worry about. But there's also this element of keeping the rich happy, keeping different people happy, and helping them come on the sides of Severus. And I'm sure she plays a role in that. But I also like the other thing you mentioned that, she's with him on campaign as well. And I think you can start to see the seeds of this is a military family at the end of the day. The kids are going to be born and they're going to live their life in military camps as well. And they're going to be on campaigns with their father. And so it really goes to show that, yes, this is a military family overall. And despite, learning the ropes of, hey, this is good governance and all that, it's very different than a Roman kid who maybe is growing up trying to learn the political ways of living in Rome and dealing with the senators. This is two kids are going to be born in this is how you fight. This is how you run an army. This is how you keep the army happy ultimately. And I think it's interesting that this is, we talked about, hey, there's maybe not many family dinners, but, the family dinners may have been around, a fire in a military camp versus, in a grand palace back in Rome.
Well, I think I think that leads perfectly to the next point, which is this whole idea that they shared a vision of this dynastic continuity. So, what does that really mean? It's this aim to establish a stable succession through their sons, Caracalla and Geta. So, as we'll see, both parents are going to be deeply invested in their children's upbringing, the best education, exposure to the responsibilities that awaited them, for this massive role that their parents hope they're going to take on. So this is where, we can start talking or pivot the conversation towards the two figures we're going to talk about today. So Caracalla is born on April 4th, 188 AD in modern-day Lyon. Julia gave birth to their first son. He would be known as Caracalla, a nickname derived from a Gaelic cloak he popularized as emperor. From the outset, Caracalla was immersed in the imperial court's opulence and the weighty successions of dynastic succession. Shortly after, so about a year later, Geta's born. He's born in Rome. While Caracalla enjoyed the privileges of being the eldest, Geta's arrival introduced a new dynamic to the relationship. Although the brothers were raised together, early differences in their personality began to surface. A lot of historians, especially those of that time, characterized Caracalla as being very bold and assertive and even hot-tempered, as we'll see, whereas Geta was much more reserved, thoughtful, and kind of inclined towards diplomacy. So you can already kind of see the differences, at least from a historical perspective, distinguishing these two as their own separate people, two different sets of personalities and strengths, but they're growing up in a hub of, intellectual and cultural activity. You got to remember that their mom, Julia, is surrounded with philosophers, artists, scholars. It's fostering an environment that valued education and critical thought. So they're both being, they're both going to be very learned when it comes to literature, philosophy, rhetoric, law, but there's also the military aspect of it, right? Given who their father is and the importance and emphasis he's put on this very strong militaristic approach to governance. So they're groomed from a very early age to continue their father's legacy, with Caracalla often accompanying Severus on official duties, which, you can start seeing, as we'll get into, some of the feelings of marginalization that might happen between the two brothers.
Yeah, it's a bit of you can never know with these situations, right? It's two brothers born. They're definitely different. They probably fight. They probably, as boys do, but you just never know where this is going to lead, right? And I think for Severus, he's looking at his boys going, all right, well, they'll rule together and things will be great. And, even the influence of Julia Domna is, again, probably some putting two and two together after the fact. But there was always kind of this small accusation that she kind of favored Geta a little bit more just because, a little bit more softer, kinder person than Caracalla. Not saying he was this ray of sunshine or anything like that. But, in comparison to the type of personality and the very aggressive personality of Caracalla, it was a little bit of the people kind of saying, hey, he's not getting, maybe the attention that he needs from his mother and those sort of things. But again, this is Roman historians at their finest. They always find a way to blame the mother. So I think it's always interesting, and you have to take that with a grain of salt. But I think we can definitely say for a fact that, Caracalla, definitely the more aggressive, less diplomatic version of the two boys, and also a little bit more cruel in a sense. And people are starting to see things that, if you give this guy ultimate power at a young age, what might he do? But there's a long way to go until that happens. But again, it's, these two boys, different personalities, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, it's interesting because, the tale of like a sibling rivalry is something that we've talked about for centuries. And even in the modern context, right? This whole narrative around, siblings. I am the eldest in my family, and I have a younger brother, and I can, say confidently that there was at one point a sibling rivalry, not to anything close to the one we're about to talk about, but, it does exist. It is real. But imagine that you're in their shoes, right? Your father is the emperor, and you're going to have some stratification between the two roles. And I think the age difference isn't even that large, right? Like Caracalla is only the elder by 11 months, but he's documented as having much more confidence, much more assertiveness far beyond his years. And when he's merely 7 years old, their father conferred upon him the title of Caesar. And this designation wasn't merely just, honorific. It positioned him as the heir apparent to the imperial throne. And, this is a pretty unprecedented move, which also clearly in my mind signals his favoritism towards his eldest. But imagine how Geta feels on the other hand. He received no comparable honor at the time. Despite being only 11 months younger than him, he remained without a title, which, publicly speaking, is almost gives him like secondary status in his own family. And this disparity didn't escape the notice of the people around him too, right? You got to think about how the imperial court or the optics looks for the brothers themselves. So as the younger brother, I can only imagine he starts to, harbor these feelings of resentment and jealousy, and understanding that, in his father's eyes and the empire, he's considered less less than his elder brother.
Yeah, that's got to be tough for Severus in that situation, because you have to have some sort of clear line of succession. If he gets killed on the battlefield or he dies of disease in the middle of the night, because that happens all the time in Rome, he's got to make sure that there's a clear line of succession, because if he doesn't, A, civil war is going to break out, and B, his kids are going to be killed very, very quickly. And so I can see why he does this by saying, all right, Caracalla, you're Caesar, you're next in line. However, he's very young, and my goodness, what that could do to us. How old was he? You say
he was 7.
Yeah. Okay. 7. That's what I thought you said. And I'm like, 7-year-old, you are now the second most powerful person on paper in the entire empire, and you will inherit everything that I inherit. And we're going to start grooming you for that. So that's going to go to his ego a little bit. And, as any kid growing up would, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to go bad. We see lots of emperors and kings and queens who grew up knowing they were going to take power and were groomed and did really well. But you're right. What is Geta feeling in all of this? There's got to be a lot of resentment. There's got to be a lot of, where do I stand in all of this? Why doesn't my father respect me in the same way? And maybe that's part of the reason some say that Geta got a little bit more attention from his mother, as kind of maybe a balancing act between the two, and her being kind of locked into how her kids are feeling, being able to kind of maybe try to even things out a little bit. But you're right, like, they're very, very young. They're being thrown into this political spectacle. And now, looking externally, like you mentioned, everyone looks at Caracalla and says, yeah, you're the guy in charge. You're the guy who's going to come next. Severus has picked you. Who's this Geta guy? What's his deal? Yeah, he's just a passenger in all of this. And, you're right. Never mind the father not giving you enough attention and maybe respect in a formal sense. Externally, you're starting to get looks. You're starting to get questions asked about you. And I can only imagine what that does to, his psyche.
I think you nailed it. That's how I kind of imagined that in my mind, right? This grand imperial ceremony that's happening with Severus, Caracalla's by his side, and then off in the shadows is Geta, kind of a secondary afterthought. As his brother of 11 months older than him is meeting, high-ranking officials, shaking hands, schmoozing, and Geta's just kind of off to the side thinking, what about me?
Yeah, and it's not like it's a huge age gap, right? Like you've mentioned it a few times, 11 months. That's nothing. It's nothing. It's not my big brother Caracalla who's helped raise me, and I've seen him go off fighting when I was a little baby, and I have so much respect for him. And this is my brother. We grew up together. We're the same age, basically. Mm-hmm. It definitely is you're number one, you're number two when it comes to at least the official titles perspective.
I think you raised a really good point. I'll probably just cap this off around like the family dynamics. Like from what I read, Julia was very aware of the growing divide between her sons, and she sought to address the imbalance. This is someone, like we've mentioned, she's someone who's very culturally refined. She's very intelligent. She understands the potential danger of the sibling rivalry, especially at the highest levels of power. This isn't some like lower class family with two brothers wanting to fight each other. There are some serious implications here if these two don't get along. So she did take it upon herself to nurture Geta's interests and talents, providing him, with opportunities to shine in the areas where he excelled. And these are the things like philosophy, literature, and the arts. And she would arrange for him to get tutors to educate him, hoping that this development would earn him the recognition and respect that he, one, deserved in her eyes, but, should have commanded given his own talents and skill set. I think in regards to that too, so Julia's efforts, extended to advising Severus on the importance of treating their sons equitably. She argued that a unified front would strengthen the dynasty and prevent these internal conflicts that could jeopardize the empire if they weren't, dealt with early. And despite her influence, Severus seemed to remain steadfast in his approach, perhaps underestimating the depth of rivalry that was brewing between his potential heirs. And I think it's an interesting insight. I almost see Severus as a guy that just is, kind of hell-bent on ruling and doesn't really pay much attention to this, small pity kind of rivalry that's happening between his two sons. He probably sees it as some sort of competition where it'll help them grow and mature and become the leaders that he wants to. But, sometimes that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, he's a military guy at the end of the day. Yeah. You have one supreme commander, you have a general, you have a commander, he's almost treating his family like a military squad or something like that. And you're right. He definitely sees this as, all right, well, it'll toughen Geta up a little bit. It'll show it to make him stronger. And, Caracalla is going to see the rivalry too. And it's just going to make them both stronger. Again, we don't know for sure, but I can imagine as a military man and the fact that he's not taking the advice of his wife here, that's probably the way he's looking at this. Is it's a very structured, rigid setup. And, let's toughen them up as young boys. Let's make sure that they're able to get to the level that I need them to get to, but through kind of that militaristic sense of, one person's in charge. I hate to say survival of the fittest, but kind of ends up being that at the end of the day. But that's kind of the world that he kind of puts these boys into, and continuously feeling that pressure and trying to almost one up the other one. It's going to take a toll after a while.
No, I think even on that front, survival of the fittest makes sense, because that's kind of a theme that I was tinkering with when I was reading and preparing for this episode. And I think even maybe he didn't even see the implications of what he was doing, right? Like, again, he's in the imperial court. People are observing all of this. It's not that difficult to pick up on favoritism, in a world where like every move is being dissected by these people who are attending the like imperial court. You're talking about officials and advisors and courtiers who are observing this favoritism, and they're going to adjust their allegiances accordingly. Many sought to secure their positions by aligning themselves with Caracalla, the apparent heir. They flattered him, they supported his initiatives, they offered counsel that reinforced his preeminence. But conversely, there's also going to be another faction that kind of emerges, a smaller but significant group that saw potential in Geta. They recognized his intelligence, the possibility that he might one day ascend to power, especially given the uncertainties of life in politics. They offered him their support. These individuals included scholars, administrators, some military officers who really valued Geta's, administrative acumen, diplomatic demeanor, and his kind of strategic thinking, given his interests and skill set when it came to those types of things.
Yeah, I always wonder what the motivation is here. On one hand, I see the people old enough to remember the reign of Commodus and, this more cruel leader, and they might see a little bit of that in Caracalla, and they're like, it's a little worrisome. But on the flip side, it might be, this might be an opportunity for me to get on, the right side of a potential fight or a potential civil war. Who knows, right? And I always wonder, like, what are the motivations? And I'm sure it's a bit of everything, but I always find it interesting in the Roman world, especially when as soon as people start to feel tension, they start to latch on to one or two people. And it gets really, really interesting, because who knows what these motivations are? Who knows what they're telling these boys? And especially the ones coming to Caracalla's side being like, Geta's actually trying to get a lot of favor with this group of people, but don't worry, we're on your side. And it's just going to start to set those seeds of resentment and anger, I would think, because really people are picking sides, not just within the family, but from outside the family.
I think you nailed it. I think there's this divergence that's already happening, right? And it's very obvious to the people in the court. They're seeing in education and training, Caracalla's focus is on military and leadership. Geta's emphasis on like these intellectual and administrative studies, giving this kind of strategic lens. And what does that lead to? There's the role of external influences. I don't think it's too far of a stretch to imagine that some of these people in the imperial court are going to exploit this rivalry for their own benefit or play the kids against each other. These are young boys we're talking about, right? Like, I'm sure they're intelligent in their own right, but how sophisticated can like a 10-year-old really be in terms of your thinking when you're playing, backdoor politics and communication channels? This is a very interesting environment for them to grow up in. And then having these people play them against each other is only going to deepen that, or like widen that, gap between the two.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit too, but I just want to bring up Plautianus because he's going to come onto the scene at some point here, but he's Severus's right-hand man. He's doing a lot of this political maneuvering, but you're right. He's got his own ambitions and he's supposed to be kind of someone who's loyal to the family, but he's starting to kind of do his own thing. And you're right. These are young boys. Like, I don't know how they're able to grow up in this world and make sense of anything that's going on, especially when they're not, I don't think, shielded from the right things and given the right things that they need. Because I think we've seen with other Roman emperors, they've been, or either families have been good at putting their kids into positions where they feel that they're kind of involved with things, but they're also able to be kids at the same time. And they're not just thrown into like this political kind of meat grinder, if you will, at such a young age. And I'm seeing every example you keep bringing up with these boys is just another thing and another thing and another thing that they need to worry about. And at the end of the day, they're not unified together. They're not this, hey, we're loving brothers and we'll do everything together. They're being kind of put at each other from such a young age, and it just continues to spiral as time goes on.
I think that's one of the tragedies of this particular episode, and we'll see how it accumulates, I'm sure, shortly. But I don't think they ever really saw each other as a family, at least from like a sibling perspective, because from day one, they're pitted against each other for competition to be, the apple of their father's eye in terms of who's actually going to be the heir apparent. And there is nothing but competition that has been bred between these two from day one. How can you ever look at your sibling in a loving, kind-hearted way when you've been pitted against them since the time you were born? I think in terms of like the rise to power, so, just to further fuel fire that is happening between these two, in the year, it's 198 AD, a significant event unfolded that would have, lasting repercussions on the Severan dynasty and the Roman Empire. At just 10 years old, Caracalla was elevated by his father to the rank of Augustus, making him co-emperor alongside Severus himself. And this wasn't merely ceremonial. It conferred upon Caracalla substantial authority and positioned him as the clear successor to the imperial throne. I just want to double underline that he's 10 years old at this point. And this is not some ceremonial title. This is a very significant title. It's the highest title in the Roman imperial hierarchy, originally adopted by the first emperor Augustus. And it essentially symbolizes supreme power and is associated with these qualities of, like majesty, reverence. And bestowing this title on him means he's effectively sharing imperial power with his young son, granting him, I guess, legal and administrative authority over the entire empire at the tender age of 10.
Yeah. Part of me understands, hey, you're doing this to shore up that if something does happen to you. But also we've seen previous emperors who have just officially named their son, they're my successor. When things happen or when they get really, really old and they know like, hey, I got like a year or two left to live, I'm going to name my son co-emperor just to even things out. But that's not the case here. Like, he's so young. And the fact that clearly he's not sharing power equally with Severus just based on the fact that he's his father and much older and more of a title to kind of calm things down. But at the end of the day, when Severus is off doing something else and Caracalla's around, he theoretically can start ordering people around and doing what he wants. And again, he's 10. He doesn't know he needs to be a kid. He doesn't need to be ruling an empire, but this is the Roman world at this time. And, I don't even know like what, again, ultimate power corrupts and all of those sort of things, but giving anything to a 10-year-old, let alone supreme ultimate power, I don't even know how to finish that sentence.
No, it's like giving a child unlimited TV time times a million. Like I can't even wrap my head around it. But, if we as adults talking about it can't wrap our heads around it, imagine how your younger sibling feels, right? I think this is like the emotional and psychological impact it must have had on Geta. Those feelings of, and he's only 9. If Caracalla is 10, we do the math, he's, just short at 9. The feelings of inadequacy, the resentment, the desire for recognition must be just in overdrive right now. Yes, he has the title of Caesar, which was, traditionally given to designated heirs, but he's still clearly a subordinate to the title of Augustus, meaning that Geta, even though he's recognized as a part of the imperial family and potential successor, he doesn't really have any authority in actual name. And I think that is something that's going to really change court dynamics, right? There's going to be a massive imbalance of power between these two, and it's going to be evident within the imperial court, right? So now everyone begins to favor Caracalla, hoping to secure their positions in his future reign because, to your point, Paul, Severus essentially just, reinforced the succession plan that this is going to be your leader after, my time has come.
Absolutely. And you're right. Now, if there was more people moving, trying to get into Geta's camp and Caracalla's camp and trying to figure out what horse they're going to back. A lot of people that may have been supporting Geta, they're absolutely changing sides to Caracalla and saying, well, he's got the title. He's legitimately an emperor right now. Thanks for nothing, Geta. We're moving over to your brother's side. And again, telling a 9-year-old that he's not special and his brother is much more special and they're the same age, like, here we are, right?
Yeah, it's bringing back some traumatic memories for me. No, I'm just kidding. But I think, again, it just goes back to this very strange dynamic between these two. And I think just to further this, they go on military campaigns with their father. So in an attempt to educate both his sons and perhaps, heal the rift between them. So it's good to note that, Severus did kind of acknowledge that there is a rivalry between the two. He decided to include both of them in his military endeavors. So he has the Eastern campaigns following a series of victories in civil wars. He turns his attention to external threats, notably the Parthian Empire, which had taken advantage of Rome's internal strife to encroach on its eastern provinces. The campaigns really want to just reassert Rome's dominance, secure borders, and expand territories. But this is where it gets really interesting for me, and I think it really stood out, was how did these two actually get involved? So Caracalla, he's an active participant in battle. He embraced the military life with enthusiasm. He rode alongside his father. He observed battlefield tactics. He demonstrated leadership. He showed courage in the face of conflict. He got his actions publicized, he enhanced his reputation, but then there's Geta, who's assigned these administrative tasks. He enjoys the logistics, supply management, civil administration in the occupied territories. He's someone who obviously is naturally inclined towards the practices of governance. He participated in the campaigns, but his contributions were less visible and celebrated. And I can imagine in a very militaristic society, this isn't going to be as favorable of a PR stunt as riding alongside your father is on the front of battle. So, again, it's this whole ideal of Geta being overshadowed by Caracalla's battlefield exploits.
I almost wonder in Severus's mind, like he's almost, I got my military commander and I've got my administrator, and maybe it's just where interest lied and that's where they ended up going. But it almost seems like maybe he had something in his mind of building this team of, hey, if Caracalla can be my head of state, strong military man, and Geta can kind of deal with all the administrative nonsense that Caracalla maybe isn't very good at, maybe this can be a really great team or something like that. I don't know what that answer is, but that's kind of what it seems like to me. But you're right. In this militaristic society, riding alongside your father, getting glory on the battlefield, like we look back at a lot of Roman leaders. Augustus is the only one that I think I can put my finger on as saying, was a really lousy military commander, but he had a right-hand man who could do all of that. And he had incredible propaganda, was an amazing orator, and dealt, in the political sphere, no one even came close to him. He was just so good at it. But yeah, you're right. It is typically the other way. You have the strong military leader. Then you have these administrators kind of behind the scenes doing a lot of work, but typically it's not the son of the emperor. So yeah, I wonder what kind of the plan was there, but I think it's interesting, right? It is very just a dichotomy of the two things that they're doing. But again, more favor and more of the, I wouldn't say interest, but influence is going towards Caracalla because of that, military element. And I'm sure the propaganda coming out of that as well, as Caracalla helped win the battle and all these sort of things, and Geta made sure we had food or something. And, it makes it a little bit trickier.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a point that almost kind of like really stuck with me after having read this part of my research was, if we like look back to the relationship between Severus and Julia, different but complementary. I kind of see the same with the two brothers, but I don't know if it's just lost on Severus, because it seems like the coupling of these two very unique but complementary skill sets would have been a great way to kind of unify the approach to, long-term governance and succession. But sadly, it didn't work out that way. So we fast forward from the Eastern campaign. So these last from 197 to 202 AD. In 209 AD, the dynamics within the Imperial family necessitated a reassessment of roles. And this is where Geta is elevated to Augustus. And the rationale behind it is a couple of things that kind of stood out to me was balancing the imperial image. So again, optics is everything. To present a unified front and perhaps quell any growing discontent, Severus decided to elevate Geta to the rank of Augustus. Politically speaking, it recognizes that the empire that is very vast and diverse, having two emperors could help manage affairs more effectively. So I think maybe starting to see this kind of complementary duality between his two sons. And it's also an attempt to address Geta's frustrations and prevent potential conflicts between the brothers. Although his promotion is marked by official ceremonies, proclamations, and all the good stuff that comes with it, like minting coins and, bearing his image alongside his own and Caracalla's, I still think it's seen as pretty superficial between the brothers, at least. While Geta is now held with the same title, there are still years of unequal treatment that have left very deep-seated scars. And now you have this continued rivalry, which takes on this very new dynamic. Geta's ambitions, empowered by his new status, probably made him want to assert himself more forcefully into imperial affairs, which again is only going to heighten Caracalla's resentment, because he may have perceived Geta's elevation as a threat to his own primacy, fearing that his own position was being undermined. So again, you in an attempt to create a unified family unit for the sake of optics and succession, you've probably now created an even more dangerous playing field for competition and influence between the two brothers, who have begun to, cultivate their own networks of support, leading to even more increased factionalism within the court and the military.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said it any better. This probably exactly what's happening. And especially with Caracalla having so many years with this official title and all the officialness that comes with being an emperor and all, the coins minted and all the things that come out of this. If we're seeing Geta's promotion as probably a way to keep him alive, one, and two, as a way to kind of soften everything, but also a little bit of a ceremonial kind of element to it, or just more of a title than really ultimate power. If we can see it, I'm pretty sure the Roman people and the Roman court can see it. And on top of that, yeah, you're right. If I'm Geta, I'm sitting on the sidelines for so long without an official title. Now I finally have one. I want to do something with this. I'm excited. I'm going to do things. And Caracalla is like, well, hold on, man. I'm the one that's in charge here. I don't know what you think you're doing. And again, we keep talking about it, but this rivalry is going to continue to boil over. And now they both have a lot of power. People are going to start running to them, and people are starting to see, Severus is starting to age. What's going to come next? people are going to start whispering in their ear, and it's going to turn a little ugly really quickly.
Yeah, I think we're almost at the kind of, crescendo of the plot. And, we'll fast forward a little bit, but, the next thing that's probably worth mentioning is this campaign in Britain. And we won't get too much into the details, but, post this campaign in Britain, Severus dies in 211 AD. His sons return to Rome as co-emperors. They have essentially inherited the vast Roman Empire, and officially, quote unquote, they are sharing power equally. But in reality, as we've discussed up to this point, there is a very deep-seated animosity leading to a very fractured administration of the empire. They are not cooperating. They're literally physically divided at the Imperial Palace. They established their own courts, complete with separate staff, their own personal security forces. And just imagine what this symbolizes for the people, this widening chasm between them, turning the heart of the empire into a house divided, like symbolically, like it couldn't get worse at this point.
For sure. And I guess it would just be for our North American listeners, but there's a show called Arthur that we all watched growing up, and there's these two kids, and in one episode they get in a big fight, and their babysitter takes a big thing of tape and puts it down the middle of the house, and Arthur gets everything on the one side and his sister gets everything on the other side. This is what I pictured the Imperial Palace being. They draw a line down the middle. You get what's over here. I get what's over here. Don't cross this line because it's going to be bad and they're going to end up fighting. And again, it's childish behavior, childish rivalries, but there's only one way for something like this to end. And there's one part I want to add to this as well. And so there's this man named Plautianus who's been kind of in the background a little bit. We haven't really mentioned too much. He was Septimius Severus's essentially right-hand man for a long time in the political space, but nobody ever really trusted him. And part of what happened was his daughter actually marries Caracalla, and Caracalla hates his daughter and hates his wife and is quite cruel to her over this period of time. But he also hates Plautianus because he doesn't trust him. And Plautianus starts to do some things as well, where he's starting to put himself involved in everything. And eventually there's a conspiracy that comes up where the claim is Plautianus was trying to assassinate Caracalla and Severus. Probably Caracalla was behind kind of these trumped up charges, and Severus eventually orders him executed. But the whole thing is, this is just another layer. This is someone who's supposed to be close to the family and loyal to the family that Caracalla absolutely hates. He doesn't trust. He's forced to marry his daughter, and he almost sees it as this person is also trying to get my control. And so never mind what's happening with Geta. This is just, I think, another example where Caracalla is in this state where people are trying to get his influence. People are trying to get into my world. You're forcing me to marry somebody. I don't trust Plautianus because he's always doing things kind of behind Severus's back for his own gain. What the heck is happening? How can I trust anybody? My father ruled with supreme military rule, one person, ultimate control. That's kind of how I want to rule. And so to your point, he hates his brother. He doesn't trust anybody around him. He sees the model of his father. It's just, again, like not even a powder keg. It's even bigger than that. Like all you need is just someone looks at someone the wrong way and full blown Armageddon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's way more than a powder keg. It's like if a nail drops, someone's going to implode over it. And I think, to my earlier point, this is about to reach a crescendo. And I'm sure our listeners who are either familiar or not familiar with Roman history can see how this is about to culminate. But the Imperial Palace is a battleground at this point. They fortified into their own quarters. Their respective supporters have engaged in covert skirmishes and espionage. So the corridors of power are filled with, suspicion, fear, spies and informants lurking in the shadows. Public affairs and administration governance are suffering. And these co-emperors are consumed with undermining each other more than they are with actually administering the empire. So, in the culminating moment, in the waning days in December in 211 AD, the Imperial Palace is still cloaked with this uneasy silence after months of this very, very bitter rivalry. Caracalla extends an unexpected invitation to his brother Geta, a proposal for peace, a chance to mend the rift that had torn the family and the empire apart. The meeting was to take place in the private chambers of their mother, who once echoed with laughter of their shared childhood about how their sons could work together. And, she, flickered, I imagine, at this attempt to reconcile between the two. But as Geta, I imagine, enters this very dimly lit room, perhaps he even felt a glimmer of optimism that these brothers could reconcile and prevail with each other rather than against each other. But no sooner than he crossed that threshold, the armed centurions that were loyal to Caracalla emerged. The air thickened with a high degree of treachery, and I assume Geta barely had time to grasp the betrayal before the blade struck. The small skirmish ensues, ending with Geta collapsing into his mother's arms. She's obviously anguished, screams piercing the stillness as she cradles her dying son, his lifeblood pretty much staining her robes, and a mother's grief compounded by the horror that her surviving son had orchestrated this fratricide, killed his own brother.
Never mind murdering your brother. That's already messed up enough. And people probably saw it coming. But to do it in front of your mother, who's been this beacon of just, this loving mother and someone who's just so brilliant and is, everybody talks about how great and smart and intelligent she is. And she's just wants her kids to get along. And like not only do you, like any mother, but at the end of the day, you don't only murder your brother, you do it in front of your mother. And, as the story goes, like you were saying, she's covered in the blood of her dead son, who's just been brutally murdered by the thugs of her other son. This is where I think when people talk about cruelty in history, these are the kind of things that I think when we talk with the most cruel people, this kind of stuff, I think, puts you into a different level. There's the, hey, I'm going to murder someone and no one's going to know what happens and we move on. But to do it of, yeah, he's coming into my mother's chamber where he thinks he's going to be safe. That's a perfect opportunity to do it. I don't care what my mother thinks about this. I got to get rid of this guy. And to just do that, it's an extra level of just messed up and cruel. And now that Caracalla is the sole ruler, the cruelty is not going to stop. But my goodness, like this is just on another level of just, I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care who's involved. And maybe I want to show a little bit of a spectacle to really show everybody and maybe even show my mother a little bit that I'm now the one that's in charge. And, nobody get any ideas of, trying to influence me in one way or another because I'm in control. The military's behind me. Now it's time to rule.
Yeah. And I think that's one of probably the craziest twists and turns we've probably talked about in any of our episodes. But as you can imagine, this news of this assassination spreads like wildfire across the citizenry. You have this emperor slain by his own brother in the sacred confines of their mother's chamber. So obviously senators, citizens are watching as Caracalla seizes control. He flips the script a little bit. He tries to communicate that actually it was Geta who tried to betray him and the murder was a necessary act of self-defense. I'm sure there's very many, like a lot of skeptics out there who, don't necessarily want to voice their concern. But here is like, we just talked about cruelty. Like we're about to take it to a new level of cruelty. So with ruthless efficiency, Caracalla initiates, I think we had said offline, Stalin-like purges to eliminate any remnants of Geta's influence, senators, knights, soldiers, civilians. Anyone suspected of loyalty to Geta were condemned. These executions numbered in the thousands, a chilling testament to his determination to eradicate opposition. And this is the part that sits with me still. To obliterate his brother's legacy, he decreed Damnatio Memoriae against Geta. Statues were demolished, frescoes defaced, inscriptions chiseled away, and coins bearing Geta's image were melted down, as if it were Geta had never existed, a ghost erased from the annals of history.
Step aside, Stalin, Caracalla did it first, and he did it efficiently. And I think I've even seen some quotes where, a little bit of people kind of putting two and two together. But, if you were to ask Caracalla about his brother, there was, the quote is, well, I'm the only son of Septimius Severus. So I don't know what you're talking about, who this Geta guy is, or I don't have a brother. I never did. And I don't know why you would even mention that. But man, it's, again, we see this in Roman history a lot. We see the, damning of a political rival who was executed or who lost the civil war. You see a lot of this, the purges to kind of consolidate power after a civil war. But the civil war never even really kicked off officially, I would say. May have happened at some point. But again, this is your brother, right? It's just, it's just different. It has a different flavor to it that just makes it so much more upsetting, I think. And in the Roman world, we are very numb to, they did purges and 10,000 people were executed. It's like, that's a lot of people. But, these are people who, supported your brother. And then to even say that, he never existed. And again, it's people talk about Stalin as being one of the most cruel people of all time. Like Caracalla is, he's pulling the same tactics. And I don't even think Stalin murdered his brother, for as far as I know. So, when we're putting Caracalla up there with, cruel leaders in history, Stalin's up there as well. And he's just incredibly cruel. What more can I say?
Yeah, the term Stalin-like purges is not one that we use with any lightheartedness, right? Like there's a special circumstance in which you use that kind of comparative analogy to make that kind of modern reinforcement to really hit home on what's happening here. We could probably speak pretty quickly on his like sole reign and consolidation of power. So with Geta eliminated, Caracalla is the sole emperor now. He focuses on securing his position by placating the military and suppressing dissent. The loyalty of the legions at this point is obviously paramount, and he spared no expense in ensuring their support. So he issues the Constitutio Antonina, an edict that granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. It's a pretty sweeping reform with significant implications. So obviously there's fiscal motivations. By expanding citizenship, you can increase the number of people subject to taxes. The cultural impact, the edict kind of blurred the distinctions between Romans and provincials, promoting a sense of unity that also diluted this kind of traditional Roman identity. And then again, the legal consequences. So extending citizenship meant that Roman law now applied universally, affecting legal proceedings and property rights throughout the empire. And here's a very interesting footnote, and I'm sure we're going to talk about him in his psychology very quickly after this, but his obsession with Alexander the Great. This is fascinating. So he idolized and sought to emulate Alexander the Great, so much so that he adopted Macedonian dress. He styled his hair after Alexander. He formed military units reminiscent of the Macedonian phalanx. He launched campaigns in the east, particularly against the Parthian Empire. He pursued these very aggressive tactics, including very deceitful diplomacy, such as proposing a marriage to the Parthian king daughter as pretext for invasion. He often visited Alexander's tomb. He would pay homage by conducting rituals that, some viewed as eccentric or, some even as blasphemous. And despite his efforts, his military campaigns lacked the strategic brilliance of Alexander. More often than not, they strained resources and yielded very limited gains.
Yeah, his reign, I know we just kind of breezed over it, but there's so much to take in. Like you mentioned, the citizenship for everybody. A lot of people look back at that and say, that was probably something that was overdue and probably needed to happen. But he's not doing it for that. He needs money. Now I can tax everybody. And if you even go to Rome today, there's the Baths of Caracalla, which is this huge complex of baths that still stand in ruins, obviously, but to this day, and you can kind of get an idea on the size of it. But even on that point about the Parthian king's daughter, the story of that is, again, he doesn't care about murdering people in safe spaces. So he basically goes to the Parthian king and says, look, I'll marry your daughter. We'll have this great relationship between these two empires that we've been fighting since the dawn of time, basically. We'll marry each other and it'll be great. So he agrees to it. And then when the wedding happens, he murders all the Parthians that show up and basically says, haha, nice try, but I'm not marrying your daughter. It was just a ruse to murder everybody. And, the Parthians are, again, always at war with the Romans, and they were pretty weak at this time and actually end up becoming the Sassanid Empire not soon after this. But again, it just seems a little bit cruel for cruelty's sake at some point. But is it effective? I don't quite know. And you even hear stories too about where he would be showing up to a small town or something within the empire, and he would say, I want you guys to build me something grand, or he would tell them what to build. He would show up, he'd go, that's great, now tear it down after she sees it. And it's all at the expense of these cities, right? So, if these places are going bankrupt, basically just to build in his extravagance. And this is, I think, that the sign of these terrible emperors. We saw it with Commodus, the obsession with gladiatorial games and this obsession with just being a warrior and how they look and everything like that. And we're seeing this with Caracalla and his Alexander kind of comparisons, but ultimately it's the spending. It's the spending on just things that, just living a lifestyle, using it to assert their power and their ego, and then eventually just building whatever they want at any time without any concern for what the treasury is. And again, this is problems that continue to happen. They deface the currency, inflation increases, and then all these future emperors have to deal with this garbage as they're like, someone comes in for a short period of time and just racks up a bunch of debt. It's really tricky to pull all of that back. And like we said at the beginning, things can be stable for a long time and it takes a long time to build that stability, but one guy can tear those down. And I think with Caracalla, at least on the finances, he really did a number on it. And, now when we start talking about emperors that come after him, it's a lot of footnotes and it's a lot of emperors who were in for a little bit and a lot of guys who were, pretty crazy in their own right until we finally get some stability. But it takes a long time. And the crisis of the 3rd century, it's in high gear at this point.
Yeah, I think you summed up obviously we kind of blew past it, but there are a lot of very important things about his leadership and governance that I think come to light. I know you mentioned his, I'll call it a habit of hurting people in small villages. So there's an example of the massacre in Alexandria. This happens in 215 AD. He visits Alexandria. This is a city known for its like intellectual vibrancy and satirical wit. And he's offended by the citizens' mockery of his fratricide and his personal idiosyncrasies. That's what we'll call them. So he sought revenge. So he invited the city's youth and leading citizens to a festival outside the city walls, to honor them, quote unquote. Once gathered, his soldiers attacked, resulting in a very brutal massacre with hundreds, some say thousands of people dying. The city's looted, numerous buildings are destroyed, and the atrocity further tarnishes his reputation and strained relations between Rome and its province. So I think it's just, there is a level of cruelty here that is very hard for me to even begin to understand or imagine.
And it's not something that I think we've seen consistently throughout his life. We've seen little inklings of it, and maybe it's just his father kept him grounded. And then when his father was out of the picture, it was, I now have nothing to constrain me. And we've talked about, rulers who are a little bit cruel, like Vlad the Impaler, for example. He's pretty consistently cruel his whole life. But at the same time, let's get someone like Caracalla, and it just must have been festering for so long under there. And it was just, you crack the can open like you shake a can of Coke and out it comes. And, start off very quickly by murdering your brother. But like even things like this, it's not necessary to do a lot of the things that you did. He could arrest the people that were speaking the way they were, throw them in jail for a while, and things would be fine. After a while, you execute one or two. But it's the spectacle. It's the how to make this a spectacular thing that's just moves people from being from a bad emperor or bad leader to a really cruel and maybe even sadistic leader.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And typically, I'm sure as the fans of this podcast can surmise, there's only a couple ways that these very cruel leaders end up leaving us. And it's the year 2017 AD. Caracalla's traveling to modern day Turkey to continue his campaigns against Parthia. He stops by the roadside to relieve himself. Seizing the moment, one of his soldiers who harbored personal grievances against the emperor approached and fatally stabbed him. Accounts vary on whether he acted alone or as a part of a conspiracy. He's immediately killed, but the emperor dies at the age of 29. And this is an even sadder twist. So Julia, faced with this very profound and personal political crisis, receives news of her son's death, and perhaps recognizing her own influences and, being overwhelmed by grief over the loss of both of her sons now at this point, chooses to end her own life shortly thereafter.
I think that's the biggest tragedy of this whole story of if you're going to take away one good person from this whole thing, it's the mother trying to just keep her boys together, her sons alive, her trying to run the empire with her husband for a long time. And ultimately that's how she meets her end. I think that's definitely the most tragic part of all of this, let alone, everything that we've just talked about.
Yeah, it's a very profound tragedy and story. I think this whole narrative between these two brothers, I think if you look back to Severus as, the emperor and what his ultimate goals were, I think there's definitely some wishful thinking that did not play out in the way that he had hoped with his two sons. I think there was a great opportunity for them to come together as this unifying force, given their own personal strengths and skill sets. But sadly, what ended up becoming was an irreconcilable rivalry that was never going to be mended at any point.
No, absolutely not. And I think we talked about it. The seeds were set from a very young age, and whatever was done to rectify it, I think happened far too late. And also just some personalities, right? We look at the type of person Caracalla is. It doesn't matter, I don't think, at the end of the day. I wouldn't, I'll put some blame at Severus's feet, definitely, for the way he kind of handled things, and he definitely did do things right, and maybe could have found a better way to deal with Geta at a younger age. But ultimately, we see the type of person that Caracalla is. He's pretty messed up as a person. And I don't think, the nature versus nurture conversation comes up all the time. And there's a lot of nature here that I don't know if nurture is going to solve, definitely with just how cruel he could be in these types of situations. But yeah, this is the world of Rome. And I think it's so interesting because we talk about these such great emperors come around and things are so good. And then they get so bad for a certain amount of time. And then someone else comes in and it's so great again. And they're, it's the thing with ultimate power, right? Is when things are good and you have a great leader, things can go really, really well, but they can go bad just as easy. Yeah. And again, murder and stabbing someone at the side of the road is unfortunately the only way to end some of these things. And it starts to set these precedents of, if you don't like the emperor, just kill him and we'll put someone else in charge, right? It's definitely, it's going to be the theme for the next 70 to 80 years until Diocletian kind of calms everything down. But yeah, this is Rome now. And it's a really a big difference from, the Rome we've talked about up to this point on the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting study on family dynamics within Rome, and also a very interesting character study on what can happen if the seeds of rivalry are planted that early between siblings and family dynamics, and how poorly things can go and how fast things can unravel given the right circumstances and context.
Yeah, it needs a little bit of everything, but at the end of the day, ultimate power, ultimate control, this is what it can become. And I think Caracalla is a perfect example of, is ultimate power corrupt? Maybe. But when you give anything to a 10-year-old,
good luck.
Good luck.
Awesome. So I think on that note, we'll wrap this episode up.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for listening.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.